The vaccine development process is a multi-stage process that begins with preclinical research. This is a lot of laboratory-based research and animal studies that create the data that are used later in developing the clinical trial protocols. Clinical trials are generally divided up into phase 1, 2, 3, and then later on phase 4 trials. Phases 1, 2, and 3 you're going to hear about a little bit later with Dr. Harrow's lecture. We spend most of the time in this class talking about phases 1 and 2. Clinical trials that have positive results will end up finishing phase 3 studies and moving on to applying for licensure with the FDA. Once licensure is granted, phase 4 studies will continue to evaluate a vaccine once it's actually put into the general population. This entire process is governed by good clinical practice, GCP, but also good laboratory practice and good manufacturing practice. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about GLP and GMP. The class is mainly focused on good clinical practice, but I'm going to go into a couple of definitions in the next few slides. This is the definition for good clinical practice. It's a standard for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials. This is the International Conference of Harmonization Good Clinical Practice Definition 1.24. Good clinical practice, GCP, and that's what we're going to be calling it for the rest of the course, it assures the credibility and the accuracy of the data and the reported results. It applies to sponsors, ethical committees, and investigators across the board, and really it ensures the accuracy of the data as well as the protection of the volunteers. Good laboratory practice applies to laboratories, and it's a set of principles similar to good clinical practice in that it's a main guideline. It provides the framework within the laboratory studies are planned, performed, monitored, recorded, reported, and archived. Good manufacturing practice applies to all drugs and devices which will be used for humans. Its focus is on purity, sterility, potency, and stability. Like I said, we aren't going to spend a lot of time on GLP or GMP, but it is really important to know that there are also regulations within ICH that cover these issues. After hearing about these regulations, you may wonder why we use clinical trials in the development of vaccines. Why are these regulations important? Why are ethics and the protection of your volunteers so important? Clinical trials are the way that we collect and analyze data to test a hypothesis. In a vaccine trial, we collect safety and immunogenicity data and look at whether it is changed in the presence or the absence of a vaccine. So why are these research standards needed? The majority of research is conducted correctly and ethically, but there have been a number of historical events worldwide that led to this need for research standards to govern the development of medicinal products. In 1937, a U.S. manufacturer used diethylene glycol in a children's syrup to treat streptococcal infections. Diethylene glycol is now known as antifreeze, but the liquid formulation wasn't studied for safety prior to its distribution in the U.S. and led to over 100 deaths within 2 months. This tragedy led to the enactment of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act by the U.S. Congress. In the 1950s, regulations requiring the registration of medicinal products for sale were put into effect in Japan to prevent the distribution of unsafe products. The Nuremberg trials in 1947 exposed unethical medical experimentation of Nazi doctors during World War II. Finally, in the 1960s, the thalidomide tragedy occurred, which you may be more familiar with. It involved a morning sickness pill which caused birth deformities. The drug safety was not sufficiently evaluated before sale. This underlines the importance of developing international regulations to govern the development of medicinal products. Regulations governing clinical trials are important not only to ensure that the products are safe, but also to ensure that the rights, safety, and well-beings of volunteers are protected during clinical trials. That phrase, the right, safety, and well-being of volunteers, you're going to hear both in the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. The Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki lay the foundations for the current regulatory and ethical guidelines that are applicable to human trials. The World Medical Association developed the Declaration of Helsinki to further clarify the Nuremberg Code with a specific focus on medical research. A key premise of the Declaration of Helsinki is that the considerations related to the well-being of the human subject should take precedence over the interest of science and society in medical research. Since then, it's been codified in various good clinical practice laws and regulations. I encourage anyone interested in the history of clinical trials and good clinical practice, specifically in regards to ethical research, to take a look at these documents, which are on the online library. The Code of Federal Regulations, which we refer to as CFR, contains guidelines on good clinical practice in the United States. These guidelines apply to trials both in the U.S. and to trials sponsored by the U.S. government. These include NIH-funded and FDA-sponsored trials around the world. Shown on this slide, you see specific titles applicable to clinical trials, specifically within 45 CFR and 21 CFR. As you can see, they apply to informed consent, institutional review boards, and procedures for investigators and sponsors to follow. You'll learn more about the specific regulations as we go through this course. In this course, we focus on ICH-GCP. This is the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice. In 1990, the International Conference on Harmonization, ICH, which included representatives of the US, European Union, and Japan, met in Belgium to try to develop a set of regulations or guidelines which would govern international clinical vaccine trials. The ICH guidelines have their origins in the Declaration of Helsinki, as evidenced by Section 2.3 of ICH-GCP, which actually closely mirrors the wording of the Declaration of Helsinki. You see these words again about the right, safety, and well-being of trial subjects as the most important considerations and should prevail over the interest of science and society. Although this course focuses largely on ICH-GCP, you'll also see how FDA CFR intersects with ICH-GCP. In 2003, the European Union actually made ICH guidelines into law, and the World Health Organization has incorporated GLP, GCP, and GMP and promoted their use globally. The ICH-GCP guidelines have several advantages. Through standardizing clinical trials, it makes them more efficient. They also have been adopted by many countries and drug companies. And as I mentioned, ICH-GCP guidelines have been adopted by the FDA and are used by many U.S. and international sponsors as the minimum standard for their clinical trial conduct. This allows for multi-country acceptance of products and faster global access to products across countries. For example, a clinical trial for an avian flu vaccine conducted in Japan would be acceptable in the EU as long as it followed good clinical practice. However, ICH-GCP does have some limitations. Currently, ICH membership does not include countries outside of the EU, Japan, and the United States, and so issues from outside countries may not be fully addressed by the conference. Another limitation of ICH-GCP is that the effectiveness can be compromised in any countries where there aren't regulatory agencies in place to enforce the guidelines. In countries where clinical research is relatively new, the infrastructure may not be developed to provide appropriate oversight. Additionally, guidelines were intentionally written to be vague enough so that countries could adapt them to their local situations. Some countries haven't done that, and so the guidelines are adopted as is and aren't nearly as effective in a local situation. So now that I've discussed the historical context of vaccine trials and good clinical practice, you may be wondering, how is GCP practically applied in the context of a clinical vaccine trial? Well, GCP is actually applied by all the parties. This includes the sponsors, the staff, ethics committees, investigators, and all site staff that are involved in the conduct of the trial. This includes anyone who obtains informed consent, manages any aspect of the study vaccine, any data collection or data analysis that's done at the site, and anyone that interacts with trial volunteers. When working on a trial, you should always be aware of GCP and its application by all parties. You will better understand the practical applications of GCP to vaccine trials as you apply GCP principles throughout the various exercises and activities in the next couple of weeks.